Hello, I'm Michael Tracy, and this video is part of my Mallory and Irvine series. Today I'm going to present a portion of the evidence that Mallory and Irvine made it to the summit of Mount Everest in 1924. The overall theory, which is presented in more detail in other videos, is that Mallory and Irvine departed their high camp and headed to the ridge to see whether there was a viable direct route. They used an oxygen bottle caching system, also described in some of my other videos, which had them caching bottles of oxygen at various places on the mountain to cut down on the weight that they were carrying. So once they got to the first step, they didn't see a easy direct ridge route, and they headed into the Great Couloir where Norton had just climbed a few days earlier. This ends up being the exact same thing that Wynne Harris did in 1933 with his group. They climbed up the first step looking for a ridge route. They didn't see one, and then they traversed over to the couloir. And then while they're traversing along here, they're scouting out this ridge to see if there's any possible way to get up through the second step in there. Wynne's group didn't see it, so they proceeded into the couloir, which is where Norton had climbed previously. After Norton's climb, he had identified two possible routes above the couloir. A gully to the right, which is not necessary. This is a small gully over here. It's not really visible on this video. That would eventually be climbed by Messner in 1980 without oxygen. And the other route was a zigzag route that was needed to be entered to the left of the couloir. That is before you get into the gully. Mallory and Irvine climbed up along the Norton zigzag route, where they were seen by Odell at 12:50 in the afternoon. This video focuses on exactly what Odell saw. In order to determine what Odell saw, we first had to determine where Odell was. Odell was climbing from Camp 5 up to Camp 6. Camp 5 is at 25,260, and Camp 6 is at 26,800 along the North Ridge. And he noted in the expedition report that he was taking a rather circuitous route outward, which would be out onto the north face, in order to look for rocks and fossils. The normal route would run sort of zigzag. I mean, this route's not precise, but it just illustrates where the North Ridge is and approximately where he would have been climbing. And he indicated that he was making some forays out onto the further onto the north face in order to look for rocks and fossils. And then he noticed that his sighting took place at about 26,000 feet. So 26,000 feet, which is just a little bit less than 8,000 meters, is just at the bottom of this telephoto picture. This was taken from base camp. And below this, there's the mountains blocking that view. But there is one important thing that we need to note here, and that is in the 26,000 foot range, there's this snowfield, and here it's quite pronounced. It's a fairly decent sized snowfield, and it's known as the 8,000 meter snowfield. 8,000 meters is roughly 26,240 feet, and this is sort of known as the death zone. There is no magic line on the mountain at 8,000 meters, but climbing above 8,000 meters is extremely difficult, and this snowfield marks the spot where climbers on the north route make that transition from below 8,000 meters to above 8,000 meters. We can also look at this picture to try to see if Odell was maybe climbing slightly above 26,000, because he notes he climbs approximately a 100-foot crag. And we can look around here, and while there's a variety of crags, there's nothing that comes close to being 100 feet. So we're going to look at a photo down a little bit lower. I'm just going to point out that when you zoom in, you can see the standard route on this particular photo. We're going to switch to another photo, and some of these features aren't going to be as obvious because of the different perspectives of where the pictures were taken. So here there's a very obvious snowfield, and below the snowfield is the standard route that is curving off towards back towards the North Ridge. So that's the standard route, and it goes off this picture. So switching over to, this is taken from the North Col. You can see the whole mountain, most of it there. And we're going to zoom back in on our route. So that is the standard route. Here I've highlighted it to make it easier to see. But here, the 8,000 meter snowfield is difficult to see. It's because it's sort of flattened out because of the angle that we're observing it from on the North Col. The standard route is barely, you can't really even make it out here. If I hadn't highlighted it, it would be extremely, I wouldn't expect you to be able to find it without spending some time. So in any case, that is approximately the 26,000 foot area, and here we can easily see some crags that are approximately 100 feet high. There's this whole ridge in here is a little less than 100 feet, but he could have been on this one, he could have been on this one. These crags here are all about 100 feet. So he was coming from the north ridge over here, so I don't think he traversed way over here in order to climb up this crag. Most likely the crag he's talking about is this first one here. So he climbs up this and he gets to the top, and what does he see? So fortunately, when I was climbing on the standard route just up here, I took a couple videos, and we're going to look at those. One of the videos is from about this spot, and then the next video is around this corner, so you can see what it would look like with some of the ridge partially covered and some of the ridge is always partially covered. So whether the first step was covered or whether the first step was not covered, we'll look at those two videos. Perhaps Odell was 30 feet below down on this ledge here, or he could have considered this all part of the same 100-foot crag and actually climbed up to that particular position. But anyway, these two videos are very close to where Odell made his observation from. So this is the first video. That's Jongbu up ahead. He's taking a break. The Sherpas climb a little bit different from Western climbers. Western climbers try to keep a slow and steady pace. The Sherpas carry much heavier loads, so they like to move in spurts. Just you can see the Changxi and the standard route behind us, but because of the weight the Sherpas carry, you frequently see them sitting down just because they don't want to keep the weight on their back. So here's the second video around the corner. Here, more of the northeast ridge is exposed. You can see the first step, second step, third step, summit, pyramid, and there's a group of climbers just entering the 8,000-meter snow slope up ahead. Now this is a screen capture that I zoomed in on from the non-black. So there'll be the two different pictures based on different positions that Odell could have been in. We'll get into exactly what Odell said, but basically there's an issue of whether the ridge was partially blocked to the first step or not. The ridge is always going to be somewhat. This stuff will always block off something. Nobody down this far, 26,000 feet, can see the entire northeast ridge. It's impossible from any position at that altitude. So the question is how much of it was blocked. And so I have two different samples from just about 100 feet apart. This one that has the first step not blocked. There's this one here, which is below some terrain, and obviously the first step is blocked. Let's look at exactly what Odell said about the sighting. And there's been a number of different accounts about it, but the best one I found was in a British newspaper, July 5th, 1924. So this was written, Odell would have still been traveling back at that time, and they did a dispatch and did this story, but some of it's written by Odell that was transferred to the Times and eventually got in this Aberdeen Press journal. First of all, just looking at the title, Mr. Odell's last view of lost climbers believes summit was reached. Mr. Odell is in the latest dispatch from the Everest expedition tells more and all that is ever likely to be known of the last hours of Messrs. Mallory and Irvine, who never returned from their attempt to reach the summit. All that is certain is that they achieved a world altitude record. So that's a critical thing. Later, in the modern literature, Mallory is not credited with that world altitude record. Norton is at 28,126. But at the time that Odell was observing it, he certainly knew where Norton had been at 28,126, and he knew that Mallory was well above 28,126. And we'll look at those different altitudes when we go back to the images. Mr. Odell believes, however, that the summit was actually reached. So that's a pretty straightforward statement. Now let's go down and look at his summary of what Odell wrote. So this is Odell writing in the newspaper. At 12:50, just after I had emerged in a state of jubilation at finding the first definite fossils on Everest, there was a sudden clearing of the atmosphere, and the entire summit ridge and final peak of Everest were unveiled. So what he says is the summit ridge, the entire summit ridge and final peak of Everest. So even if we go back to our last image, technically the summit ridge, that the way the modern language is used, is not what Odell would have been talking about. The summit ridge is just this little part between the false summit. So there's the false summit here and the real summit here, and there is a gradual snow slope along this region that is referred to as the summit ridge. And the standard route goes over here to the summit traverse and then back up to the summit ridge. But that's not what he's talking about. But when he says summit ridge, he does not mean the entire northeast ridge. The entire northeast ridge cannot be seen from anywhere near that location. It's always going to be partially blocked. Here, about 3/4 of it is not blocked, and here about half of it is blocked. So when Odell says the summit ridge, he never said the entire northeast ridge. He just said the summit ridge. I take that to mean not the literal summit ridge as we use in the modern language, but just the ridge near the summit. So in either one of these pictures, the ridge near the summit is not blocked. This could certainly qualify as the ridge near the summit, and this would certainly qualify for the ridge near the summit. But in neither one of these can you see the entire northeast ridge. Okay, back to Odell. My eyes became fixed on one tiny black spot silhouetted on a small snow crest beneath a rock step in the ridge, and the black spot moved. Another black spot became apparent and moved up the snow to join the other on the crest. So he's talking about a snow crest. So he's not saying that the snow crests the top of the ridge. He says there's a snow crest and it's beneath a rock step. So the snow can't go all the way up to the ridge because there's the snow crest, which basically means a snow slope, and then there's a rock step that's on the ridge, and there's two black dots moving across these. And the black spot became apparent and moved up the snow to join the other on the crest. The first then approached the crest rock step, so here he refers to it as a crest rock step, and I just take that to mean that it's a rock step that's on the crest of the ridge, and shortly emerged at the top. The second, get up to the top here, the second did likewise. Then the whole fascinating vision vanished, enveloped in cloud once more. There is but one explanation. This is still Odell. There was but one explanation. It was Mallory and his companion moving, as I could see, at that great distance with considerable alacrity, realizing doubtless that they had none too many hours of daylight to reach the summit from their present position and return to camp with the nightfall. The place on the ridge mentioned is a prominent rock step at a very short distance from the base of the final pyramid, and it was remarkable that they were so late in reaching this place. So here he clarifies that it's a very short distance. Going back to the first step, this, especially to somebody who's climbing on Mount Everest and knows distances that these different things take, this first step is not a very short distance from the final pyramid. The second step with this snow slope here, you wouldn't really be able to see the people on it. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the second step. I mean, we'll do another video to show you that even if they did manage to somehow climb that second step in 5 minutes, which would be a miracle, he still wouldn't see them up at the top of this step because you don't actually crest the ridge there. You wouldn't crest the ridge. You really wouldn't see people walking along that route at all because they're slightly below the crest of the ridge. Where you would see people is when they obviously go up the third step here, or if they were going around the third step, which would be from across this snow slope. But there's some interesting things in this article that were not reported in the expedition report, the Fight for Everest 1924, or in the other journal entries from Mr. Odell. So we'll just read through it and see what the interesting stuff in this particular article is. Bad conditions. According to Mallory's schedule, they should have reached the rock step, several hours earlier if they had started from the high camp as anticipated. That they had encountered bad conditions and snow-covered rocks and other obstacles was likely. However, in my opinion, from the position in which they were last seen, they should have reached the summit at 4 p.m. at the latest, unless some unforeseen and particularly difficult obstacle presented itself on the final pyramid. This seemed to be very unlikely, for we had scrutinized the last slopes with telescopes and binoculars and had seen that technically the climbing was easy. So that's another key piece of evidence that wasn't really presented in the journal, is that he says that from their last position, they should have no trouble making the summit by 4 p.m. So this would be 12:50 to 4 p.m. That's 3 hours and 10 minutes. Again, anybody familiar with climbing on Mount Everest and the distances would not think that somebody at the first step would have a remote chance of making the summit at all from that late in the day, let alone by 4 p.m. If by chance he somehow saw them at the top of the second step, this traverse here over to the third doesn't take that long. It would, maybe be half an hour or something like that. So it would put him half an hour behind there. They'd be very pressed to make it by 4 p.m. at that point, but it's possible. But with anybody saying that you're going to be at the summit by 4 p.m. and it's 1 p.m. or 12:50, there is no way that the person is seeing a location below the second step. It's too far, it's too low. And the other thing in terms of the height is, earlier we know that he said he broke the altitude record. Now, Norton was in this area here where he had the 28,126 foot altitude record. So if he saw him over here, that's not really above Norton's position. The only way he'd be certain that Mallory was above Norton's position without getting into, surveying equipment and stuff like that was obviously if he saw him directly above it, immediately to the left, or not too far from the left. He'd really have to see him well above Norton's high point in order to confirm and tell the Times that Mallory is the owner of the world altitude record and it doesn't belong to Norton anymore. And when you go back and you do look at some of the stuff in the reports and in the movie Epic of Everest says that he is 600 feet below the summit. And if you look at the altitudes and everything, 600 feet below the summit is right below the third step. So based on all the anecdotal evidence from Odell, it would place him at about 600 feet below the summit, which would allow him to climb that in about 3 hours. That would be hard pressed. You'd have to, for 3 hours to make 600 feet, you'd have to do 200 feet a minute. 200 feet an hour. That would be pretty fast at that altitude. He would be on oxygen. He'd have the extra 10 minutes, so it would be very pressed, but it'd still be possible to make the summit by 4 p.m. Mallory had already discussed that his personal drop-dead turnaround time was 4 p.m. So if Mallory was thinking the same thing down here at 12:50, that he could make the summit at 4, he would press on because he was still within his predetermined bounds of safety. Let's turn it around and look at the reverse position, that is, looking back down at this position from up above. So this is looking up on from the snow triangle a little bit above the third step. And fortunately, let me clear those things off for now. We'll come back to them. We have some climbers exactly in the position. So there's really, the 3 steps is broken down into 3 parts. There's sort of an Alpha, a Bravo, and a Charlie. Here, Alpha is just barely visible. It's hidden behind Bravo, and Charlie is visible up here. So these climbers are just on the top of third step Bravo, cresting the ridge. They'd be silhouetted at this point, that is, along the skyline from Odell's position. So let's look where Odell is. Hopefully you remember our snowfield. So that is the 8,000 meter snowfield. And you can see, if we zoom in, you can see the standard route crossing it. So let me highlight the standard route. It's from, so Camp 2, you can barely see. So this is the modern climbers call it Camp 2. In Mallory's time, it would have been called Camp 5. And they're roughly in the same spot. Mallory's camp may have been up a little higher, but these are the tents along modern Camp 2, and then there's the route proceeding up the and there's some more of the route down here. I didn't draw that portion in. And if you look further, if you want to go further down, you can see Advanced Base Camp down there. And if you're curious, there's North Cole is down here. So that would be Mallory's Camp 4, and then this would be Mallory's Camp 5, and then so Odell was going from 5 up to 6 via this circuitous route, looking for fossils. He said he walked out onto the ridge. I mean, out onto the face in order to tackle a crag that was about 100 feet. And here we have a couple options for these crags we had seen in the other piece, and they're essentially this group of rocks right in there. So, you know, that position there is what Odell was climbing, and he may have been, you know, further back on this side because he was coming off the ridge. So he'd probably be on the east side of it, working his way up. And he was just doing it for practice and, you know, for exercise to climb a more difficult portion but safe portion. So he climbs up this 100-foot crag, and you can see in this ground here, he'd most likely be standing right in this spot, which is sort of the top of that crag. And you can see that this terrain above is going to block the view of a significant portion of the ridge. Most likely the first step was entirely blocked. And Odell says that in the report, that there's a distinct possibility that the first step was entirely blocked from his view. So that just leaves this second step. Also, there was no concept at the time for the climbers of a third step. They did not refer to it as a third step. There was the first step and the second step, and that was it. They hadn't really looked at a bunch of other stuff. And here you can clearly, more clearly see the Alpha, the Bravo, and the Charlie. And so sometimes when Odell says the last step but one, and he doesn't know what that means, I don't know exactly last step but one means, but there's essentially 3 little mini steps in here, and he's just referring to them as ridge rock steps. That means a rock step that's on the ridge. And there are, you know, the Charlie's kind of small, but Alpha sticks out, Bravo sticks out. If somebody said, well, there's 2 small rock steps up there on the ridge, that would be a perfectly reasonable statement, you know, just describing that location. So going back to Odell's, this is the reverse view. So Odell would be looking up at these people across from a position right, that's the crag, so he'd be slightly above that, and that's what he would be looking at. After that, Odell proceeds back up to Camp 6, which is around this location for Camp 6. So this is the modern Camp 3 over here, and Camp 6 was way off on the backbone of the North Ridge in that section. And so Odell climbs up to 6. He walks around in here during the storm, essentially looking for them, but he can't see anything because there's too much snow and wind. He returns back to the tent, and then he descends back down at about 4:30. And the reason for that, I have a personal anecdote. When I was on the descent, right about in the first step, I had a very bad fall. You fell and slid down the snow here, caught in the ropes, but was tangled. And Jongbu Sherpa came along about 5 minutes later, and it was a little bit of work to get me back on my feet. So anyway, I'll tell that complete story later, but that's not really relevant to why Odell went down as much as this next part. So Jongbu and I got back into our Camp 3, a high camp, late in the day, and there was clouds coming in, and we decided to spend the night there because we weren't ready to go back any further that night. We hadn't anticipated it, so most of the equipment had been evacuated from that camp, and between Jongbu and I, there was only one sleeping bag. So that is the reason I always carry a 2-headed coin when I climb on Mount Everest. So just kidding. We split the sleeping bag, and Jongbu and I had a very cold and long night. So when Odell is up here in Camp 6, and Mallory and Irvine are out here, and he expects them to come back. Well, if you look around Camp 6, there's only one tent and 2 sleeping bags. So if there's 3 people and 2 sleeping bags, Odell knows he's going to get the short end of that stick, and he has to descend to Camp 5. Then he goes down to Camp 5. The problem was earlier at Camp 5, Mallory and Irvine had accidentally knocked their cooker down the slope, so they lost their cooker at Camp 5, and that's vital because a cooker equals water. So without the ability to melt snow, you can't drink anything, and also hot water is primarily what you use to regulate your heat. That's what gets you warm in the morning. That's what gets you warm at night, and then you put it in your sleeping bag, and it keeps you warm all night. So hot water is critical. Without a burner, it's you can't stay at a camp. So Odell comes back down to Camp 5, and there's no burner, which would mean if he spent the night there, there'd be no water. So he has to go back down to North Cole. He spends the night there, and then eventually works his way back up here. So, exactly when Mallory fell and when they died, we'll get into that in the video on the fall. But Odell's movements were complicated by the loss of that burner. Had the burner not gone down the hill, Odell likely would have spent the night in Camp 5 and could have immediately come up to Camp 6, which would have given him more time to look around and essentially beat the restriction on him, because Norton got the message, from North Cole that there was a problem, and Norton gave the instruction that Odell was not allowed to go above Camp 6. So Odell was not allowed to go look for them, because at that point, Norton had figured they were lost, and if you had 2 people lost, there's no reason to lose 3 people, which, it's his executive decision and a wise one, because he didn't lose 3 people. But in terms of, our modern mystery of Mallory and Irvine, obviously we would have preferred if Odell had the cooker and stayed in Camp 5, had proceeded up to Camp 6, and then had walked around in this region and maybe seen, who knows what he would have seen. I don't think he would have gone up as far as the ice axe location or anything like that, unaided, because Odell was by himself. But you never know what he would have seen. So, up here is the ice axe. This is the first step, and this is, the other. The exit cracks are over here. They wouldn't have been as far down as this knob coming off the ridge here. So the final thing I'll comment on while we have this picture open is, the ease of seeing people up here on the 3rd step. They're on the crest. But even with this is a fairly good picture. You can barely see the people on the top of the 2nd step. There's 3 climbers down there. If I zoom in, you can start to see that, there's one climber here sitting down. There's one just off the ladder, and there's another one coming up just below the ladder, it looks like. But you're still well below the ridge at that point. Let me flip over to a brief video. Okay, so this is not me. This is Juan, a Chinese climber on our team. So he shot with a Sony Action Cam, which has a steadying device for the lens. My videos were shot with a GoPro, which does not, and I did not have a camera steadying device, one of the handheld steadying devices. So his videos are nice and smooth, and if you saw my earlier video of me traversing across the slabs, it was very bumpy. So here he just got up. He's almost up the 2nd step. There's one last 3-foot step here to get up that he's panting. I've cut the audio out because he's really breathing hard and coughing a lot at this point. He had a tough time getting up that ladder, so I cut his audio out. So he's going to make it up this last 3-foot section. And the main thing to look at here, if you look at the Sherpa up ahead, interesting, you'll see he's engaged in oxygen bottle caching. He's switching out a partially used bottle, and he's putting in a brand new bottle, and he's going to leave this bottle here, and it's going to be attached to the rope with a tag on it that tells him information about the bottle. But looking around this area of the second step, so Juan's really moving slow here, and this isn't uncommon when people get to the top of the second step at this location. It is very tired. They're very tired, but you can see you're well below the actual crest of the ridge. You're not really going to be, you're not silhouetted against, the back skyline at this point. The ridge, about 10 or 15 feet up. There's his oxygen bottle falling down. So you don't want that to happen. That'll end your climb very quickly. So, over here you can see this is a good picture. You're well below the crest of the ridge, and you're not going to climb up to this rock over here, to get to the crest of the ridge. You're going to stay below it, and you sort of wind your way up, the third step. So that is why, and then here you can see this trail, and you see this trail. This is the standard route along this along that sidewalk, and this is why the modern route is so efficient. Obviously, once the ladder is there, the second step is still difficult, but it's it's a climbing challenge. Not so much. It's just climbing a ladder. And once you're on top of it, this traverse is about 750 feet, about 200 meters or so, 250 meters. This is quite a long traverse, and it's very easy. You can see in this, just from this picture, that it's not flat. I mean, it's actually headed uphill at a decently steep angle, but it's very safe. It's a little bit, it's kind of scree, so sometimes you can slip on the little rocks, but you're not going to fall anywhere. If you did fall down, you'd hurt your knee or something like that. When you look at that compared to a lower traverse across these slabs down here, which is where you would have to do to take, the Norton, Mallory's routes up through this thing, that traverse is much more difficult. And obviously, in the modern area, you couldn't climb down here while people are climbing up here, because people drop oxygen bottles and water bottles, rocks. There's a bunch of people, and they're flailing around trying to climb the mountain, and all sorts of stuff gets knocked down. So if somebody was going to, if I go back and try to climb the Mallory route, probably bring a helmet with me, and right when we turn the first step, we're going to have to move very, very quickly to get past this, just because there's crap that's going to come down from all the climbers, or just leave it at a different time. So that's why, even if this Mallory route is feasible and it's very easy, it's not going to turn into a favorite route on Everest, because the people higher up are going to be knocking stuff down on you, and climbing down here may be perfectly safe. Obviously, Mallory didn't have to worry about people knocking things down on him, but for anybody else, there's 100 ways there's 100 ways to die on Everest. Dying from a falling oxygen bottle, I would have to say, would be probably last on my list of the ways to go. So in any case, that's the review of what Odell saw. I think he was back here, and even if he could see, the first step, he said they could make it to the summit in 3 hours. It was very close, and they were going across a snow slope that took about 10 minutes, and a rock step that took about 5 minutes. I'll get into, there's another, maybe put it up on the website, maybe a different video, about, there's really two different routes. There's the Norton route, which is sort of going to come in from this side, and then there's the Somerville route. So I could have it marked here. That's the Norton route. It sort of comes off this thing. Somerville later had identified a route a little bit to the east of Norton's route. They'd sort of end up in about the same spot, but one would have them coming up a little, Somerville's route would have them coming up a little bit lower. So, but in either case of those routes, it's going to take, about 10, 15 minutes to get through that snowfield. And you could easily get to the top of either third step Alpha or third step Bravo in 5 minutes. And that's why I think Odell was down approximately in this location, maybe about, 20, 30 feet lower. And what he saw was two black dots approaching a prominent rock step on the ridge. One of the black dots went to the top of the ridge in about 5 minutes, and that matches exactly with this location.